So, you there yet?
You mean this shithole?
That's where they all hang out. Our information tells us that there's 14 of them.
And they're all for hunting.
Nah, keep one alive so we can ask who the boss is.
Anything else I should know?
Nah, not really. You'll know when you see them, they're, different.
Will do.
Well, may the Lord smile.
And the devil have mercy.
Ever since I first played it 4 years ago, I've never really been able to stop thinking about Killer7. It's a world, style, and experience that's lodged itself so deeply into my brain that it's practically taken up a permanent residence there. Killer7 devoured my very being over the course of that first playthrough. I spent as much time as I could playing it, and whenever I wasn't doing that, I racked my brain trying desperately to unpack the one simple question that underpinned the entire experience. What the fuck is this game?
Prepare to die! We are the Punishing Rangers! The Handsome Men!
It's a question without an answer. Killer7 is a game that, at every turn, defies description and thoroughly rejects explanation. There's no point of comparison, no easy way of saying, well, if you like this, you'll probably like Killer7. I've seen it described as a horror game, but what other horror game is this outrageously funny, colourful and charismatic? And, for that matter, what other comedy game is this twisted and disturbing? The only thing I can tell you is that this game is like nothing you've ever played. It's like nothing you've ever seen. Killer7 is an utterly singular work. So then, if Killer7 can't be explained, then why does this video exist? Well, the game recently got announced for Steam, and in anticipation of that release, I wanted to make something that would show why I think this game is so special. What keeps it lodged in my head after all these years, and also why I think it's a game that anyone can appreciate. Killer7's reputation for the wider gaming landscape seems to begin and end at "it's really weird," which, while true, does the game a bit of a disservice in my opinion. There's so much more to it than just weirdness, and I think that reputation might put a lot of potential fans off the game. While I first picked up the game based solely on that promise of weirdness, I can't imagine the same is true for most people out there. I want to show the real appeal of the game, why new players need to get aboard this crazy train. At the same time though, I want to dive deep into the rabbit hole that is Killer7 and discuss just how much this game means to me, and I can't really do that without spoiling the hell out of it. So, in order to make sure that potential new players don't get spoiled, the first part of this video will focus on the non-spoilery aspects of the gameplay and the story, while the second part will talk freely about some of the game's biggest surprises, as I attempt to dissect just what makes this game so important to me. Got it? Good. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's stop messing around. It's time to strap in and unpack just what makes Killer7 secretly good. Okay, let's start at the beginning, because after all, it's not like the game itself does you that courtesy. Killer7's back of the box summary does little to prepare you for the experience of playing through it. It invites you to step into the mind of an assassin, a premise anyone who's heard of Suda51 and Grasshopper Manufacture's games should already be intimately familiar with. When I began my first playthrough of Killer7, I had just stepped out of the mind of another of Suda's assassins, No More Heroes Travis Touchdown. His game was bizarrely written, to be sure, but it couches much of its narrative in darkly satirical reinterpretations of classic video game tropes, which made it surprisingly accessible for someone who only knew Suda51 by reputation, like myself. How much more of a leap could this game about a schizophrenic assassin fighting giggling suicide bombers really be?
So, What do you think, partner?
Oh. Oh no. Well, hold on. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. You play as the titular Killer7, or the Smith Syndicate, the game uses the two terms interchangeably, a kind of gestalt assassin made up of, confusingly, 8 different playable personalities, seemingly being led by Herman Smith, a man with godlike powers, and a strained relationship with one Kun Lan, an equally powerful presence, attacking the world with his mysterious heaven smiles. A group of giggling suicide bomber people things? Look, what they are isn't important. What is important is that you and your other personalities are the only ones who can stop them. But how, I hear you ask? Well, if you'll just step onto this segue with me, we'll slide on over to the gameplay section of the video where we'll discuss exactly that. Killer7 has been described as being essentially sort of a rail shooter, and I'd say I broadly agree with that. You move across levels on a track, going forward with the A button, turning with the B button, and pressing the R button to aim your gun. When you're not fighting enemies, you'll be exploring the level and solving puzzles, using clues found by talking to these ghost things. Enemies will make their presence known not by popping out of cover, but through a menacing giggle, which is your cue to scan the environment to reveal the invisible heaven smiles. Now, time to unload on them, right? Wrong! Thinking Killer7 will ever be self-explanatory? Oh, you must be new here. The actual way to play this game, in an almost complete inversion of the frantic pace of most rail shooters, is to take your time, carefully lining up each shot on enemy weak points, getting those critical hits that will kill enemies instantly and shower you with pints of delicious blood, which you can then take back to this velvet room-ass place and use to upgrade all the various personas at your disposal. Oh yeah, the whole personas, personalities thing. Maybe I should have started with that. So, while you technically only play as one character at a time, you can actually play as the entirety of the Smith Syndicate by switching between personalities, each one with their own unique weapon, strengths, weaknesses, and abilities. Dan Smith is a solid all-rounder who can use his battle shot to destroy otherwise immune targets. Kaede is slow and weak, but her scope pistol is very handy. Plus, she can bleed in order to open doors. Look, I know this all sounds pretty weird, and it is, but once you start thinking about it, it's actually pretty surprising how a lot of this stuff is still relatively standard game mechanics you've probably encountered before, but they're twisted just enough and in enough places that when you put it all together, it feels wholly unrecognizable. Yes, you are switching between personalities with magical powers, but what you're essentially doing is just switching between characters to solve different problems, which is a pretty common game mechanic. And even though the method by which you navigate it is unfamiliar, the level design itself is pretty recognizable as the late 90s, early 2000s Capcom game format. You know, running around an enclosed environment with a healthy amount of backtracking, finding various interpretations of keys to use on various interpretations of locks, solving puzzles that range from pathetically simple to hair-tearingly obtuse, all while fighting zombie-like enemies. It's the same level design used by Resident Evil, Onimusha, Devil May Cry, and pretty much every single other game Capcom was churning out around that time, which should make it feel intimately familiar to the millions of people who have played any of those games. The difference is, instead of trudging through with tank controls or any control scheme that would offer even the slightest fraction of verisimilitude, you experience these environments through the medium of a rail shooter designed by someone whose only experience with the genre is hearing someone describe Time Crisis down a phone with a bad signal. Despite the off-kilter gameplay and presentation, Killer7 still has a traditional loop of exploration, combat, and reward that anyone who's played a game in the last 10 years would be familiar with. There's even boss battles, a very traditional video game trope that you often don't find in these sort of arty games, but it's hard to realise that's even what they are. because they're buried under a mountain of obfuscation. That makes it really difficult to see that you are playing through a traditional boss battle. You're walking through the levels like normal, until you suddenly come across this strange room that looks like an entrance to a nightclub. This weird guy demands things that are apparently bullet shells but clearly aren't. Then you're sent into this staircase where some hype as fuck music plays. For this tiny room exclusively. Then, you find yourself in this strange room, where your character runs around seemingly aimlessly, avoiding the obvious exit until you encounter this ghost boy who gives you oblique clues about the enemy you're about to face. And then, after all that build up,
doesn't it?
you enter a room, fight an enemy that, more often than not, is just a slightly different version of every other enemy you face so far, and then you just leave again. It is a boss battle, but the layers of absurdism draped over the whole situation makes it feel like something else entirely, juxtaposing the traditional tropes of massive build-up towards a boss fight with the completely mundane nature of the boss fight itself. This kind of clever mix of expectation fulfilling and subverting is all over the game's design, and manages the quite remarkable feat of making tried and true game mechanics feel like something from another dimension. Surprisingly though, creating this atmosphere through the mechanics does not come at the cost of making the game less fun. On the contrary, the game's style only serves to elevate what may have otherwise been a somewhat rote experience. How could landing critical hits be anything other than mesmerizing when this is the feedback you get from it?
This is too easy.
How could traversing these environments be anything other than a joy when it's presented as well as this? Killer7 is an absolutely sublime audio-visual presentation that manages to make the incredibly simple mechanic of shooting glowing weak points and holding down a button to explore an environment thoroughly engaging and entertaining, through the careful balancing act of being familiar and accessible enough to make playing the game easy, whilst at the same time being off-kilter and strange enough to make recognizing how familiar the mechanics are very, very difficult. It's not just the gameplay that's elevated by the game's presentation though. Killer7's sense of style is all over the cutscenes and the story, making even the simplest scenes and conversations utterly enthralling to watch. Even when you're not sure what's going on, what people are saying, or what anything has to do with anything, it's still impossible to take your eyes off the strange and wonderful spectacle unfolding before you. Divorced from the larger narrative, you can still appreciate these scenes as the funny, scary, and engaging bits of direction that they are on their own, without needing to understand how they fit into an overall plot. Much like with the gameplay, you can love Killer7 just by appreciating these little scenes on their own. And I find that this is the case with a lot of individual aspects of the game. Even if you don't understand or appreciate Killer7's broad narrative, you can still love it because of the other pieces of the game. It's a reading that the game's structure supports. The game is divided into 6 missions plus an epilogue, and each one of these missions offers its own self-contained mood, style, and, to a certain extent, narrative that can be appreciated all on its own, divorced from the wider plot. If the labyrinthine political satire of Sunset doesn't do it for you, who's to say you won't adore the comedic absurdity of Cloudman? As if to underline this point, the game even shifts into completely different aesthetics for the cutscenes in a couple of the chapters, marked changes that visually illustrate the new setting or narrative you're walking into. The plots of each of the individual chapters aren't necessarily any less weird than the overarching story, but I do find them to be a bit more digestible on a basic level. If there's one aspect of the game you can always enjoy, no matter what, however, it's the music. It's an incredibly varied soundtrack that manages to perfectly roll with the game's punches, matching every disparate tone, setting, and situation the game throws at it. Even when a scene becomes so confusing that you're not sure what way you're supposed to be thinking, the music grounds you in the emotional reality of the situation. You may not know what a scene is supposed to tell you, but thanks to the music, you'll always know how a scene is supposed to make you feel. And how the game makes you feel is far more important than what's going on in the literal actions of the plot. When Killer7 is brought up, its strange and confusing narrative often dominates the conversation, not without reason. But not only do I think the incomprehensibility of that narrative is somewhat overstated, it's not everything the game has to offer. It's not all the game is. You can enjoy Killer7 for more things than just that, for the gameplay, the style and presentation of it. You can enjoy the strange and wonderful experience it is just on its own. You don't have to understand Killer7's plot to love it. And you know why? Well, allow me to let you in on a little secret. The plot is actually one of the least important aspects of Killer7's storytelling. The feelings the game gives you are far more important than that. Those feelings, the emotional reactions to what's happening in front of you, are where you'll find your meaning in Killer7, because it's sure as hell where I find mine.
Garcian, how long has it been?
The Master is awake.
I've made mention of the fact that Killer7 is a weird story, weirdly told. And while that is true, I don't want to give the impression that it's just an incomprehensible load of nonsense. Suda didn't just get high and write down a bunch of shit he thought would sound cool, like he did for Killer is Dead. Killer7's strangeness is measured, deliberate. There's method in its madness. While it can be vague at times, there's also an inordinate amount of exposition, diving deep into lots of facets of the game's plot and setting. So, why is it still so strange? I think it's because the story is full of carefully constructed contradictions that prey upon and undermine what little concrete information the player is able to glean from the story. The game's opening mission sets up a power struggle between Harmon Smith and the enigmatic Kun Lan that never really happens in any obvious or understandable way. Instead, the next mission opens with a primer on an incredibly bizarre alternate history where the internet no longer exists, air travel is banned, and total nuclear disarmament has already occurred. Just when you're wondering what happened to the whole heaven smile thing you spent the first chapter dealing with, they're reintroduced, except now they look completely different and are only referred to as smiling faces, a name that only comes up like once after this cutscene. You begin to settle into the idea that this game is going to focus on the heaven smiles or smiling faces, whatever, and the Killer7's mission to eradicate them. But then, the game promptly shifts tracks completely to be about a political struggle between Japan and America. And it's baffling, but at least it seems, tangentially related to the other stuff. Kun Lan and the Smiths do seem connected to the governments involved in the conflict, and just when it seems like you have a vague grasp on things, this happens.
The name's Andre Almeida. I am a man with a plan. The people will come to me for salvation. I have a hunch that something's gonna happen. Take this Stacy concert going on right here. Something very bad is gonna happen here. You ever met the kind of people that come to these Stacy concerts? These dudes have got energy to spare. We're talking guys who beat off 4 times a day. This is an epicenter of energy, man. But this Stacy they love, she's an illusion. But in the new age, there's no fooling them, no sir. They won't be tricked by illusions anymore. Oh my God, I can't hold back. Oh God, I'm coming. Yeah! Woo! See, I told you, this is real.
We are not just off the rails here, people. Our train has transformed into a plane, left orbit, and landed on another planet altogether. the game has completely contradicted and disregarded its own premise. The majority of the game's missions feel completely separate from one another, with only vague thematic connections and tenuous story relevance linking them. Characters and plot points are brought up with a great deal of significance placed upon them, only for them to be routinely dropped or for contradicting evidence to appear that completely undermines your sense of who these people are supposed to be. Even when it looks like the game might be revisiting the connection between Japan, Kunlan, and the Heaven Smiles in the 6th chapter, those things end up having only tangential relationship to the climax that follows. The game ends with the player having very little idea of what just transpired, but also leaves them with practically no answers to the most basic questions of storytelling. And that's not even counting all the contradictions that build up in your head over the course of the game that just end up adding to your constant confusion. Japan is threatened with nuclear annihilation in a world where world peace has occurred and everyone's given up their nukes. Garcine is a complete footnote in the gameplay unless you die a lot, whilst being by far the most prominent Smith in the cutscenes. Samantha is a character who is simultaneously a completely loyal and soft-spoken maid and a rude, sexually abusive cretin who demonstrates irritation and outright hostility to her employers when she isn't being paid by them. Kunlan is the game's main villain, but he's barely in it and doesn't appear to actually do anything of any consequence.
At any rate, I confirmed his birth date. It's November 22nd, 1942. Wait a minute. This can't be right. That's over 50 years ago.
A certain character dies 3 times on 3 separate occasions, each of which appears completely mutually exclusive to one another. Even the game's supplemental material doesn't help. There's a book out there called Hand in Killer7 that supposedly helps shed light on stuff in the game, but half the information it gives is either stuff that's already in the game or directly contradicts what's already in the game, and then the other half of the book is spent contradicting itself. First Life Industries, by the admission of its CEO, is a corporation that exists only to run advertisements, but according to the book, it's also one of the biggest companies in the world who have products and homes all over the USA. How could the CEO of the Ishizaka Corporation die 10 years older than he should have? One character is apparently 4 different people, some of which are in opposition to one another, and Kunlan is a deity-like entity that's also apparently an old man living in a bunker controlled by the US government? Why does nothing have anything to do with anything? This is what Killer7 is. It is a game that self-destructs its own narrative coherency on an hourly basis, consciously and deliberately. But why? Why do this? Well, I have a few ideas. Killer7 met me at a very particular time in my life. I first played it years after it came out, during my first year at university studying international politics. I didn't understand it then, of course. I had no idea what Suda51 was trying to say, outside of vague theories and scattered ideas tied together with nothing more than the faint air of desperation, surrounding someone grasping at whatever straws they could find to convince themselves that they had an intimate understanding of an indecipherable auteur's intent. I didn't understand Killer7, but in some way, I felt like it understood me, or at least I understood what it was saying to me. Killer7's a deeply political game. The machinations of the United States and Japan play a key role in a number of the game's missions, and there are entire segments and an enormous amount of exposition dedicated to the minutiae of the nations and their political parties. But there's just as much of the game that abandons this political focus in order to dive deep into the individual concerns of its eclectic cast of characters. From the rivalry between Dan Smith and Curtis Blackburn to the perplexing puzzle that is Emir Park Reiner. Killer7 is a game that opens on a narrator telling us the political situation the world of the game is in, before ending in earnest on a rooftop of the Union Hotel, on the inner world of one Garcia Smith. These are 2 contradictory halves to the game, political and personal, yet it's a conflict I found to unify the game, rather than divide it. See, when I first started studying politics, I thought I knew how the world worked. I thought I knew about the power players, the secret machinations and the hidden policies. When I began my university course, my assumption was that my studies would only deepen that understanding and leave me seeing all the gears in the great machine that was the world. Except, that's not what happened. I found that the more I read, the more I learned, the more I came to the unnerving, disturbing conclusion that, in reality, the world was far messier and far more complicated than I possibly could have imagined, and, terrifyingly, not even the people who had spent their entire lives studying this very topic seemed to have the understanding I sought. Not only did I not know how the world worked, no one knew how the world worked. Most political fiction holds the view that that younger self of mine had. They depict worlds of conspiracy, concrete factions, and understandable motivations. Heroes and villains use their influence in clear, measured ways, and, more often than not, receive the results they expect. It's often a genre about dangerously intelligent people creating complex plans to change the world how they see fit, whether for good or ill. Killer7 is not this. Its politics are borderline incomprehensible, being an impenetrable miasma of characters, factions, motivations, none of which ever come together in a coherent way to give us a picture of what this world actually is. Whenever we do get to peek into the minds of the political heads of this world, their actions don't bear the characteristics of the political schemers and masterminds of shows like House of Cards or The West Wing. They're self-concerned, flawed, often petty and insignificant characters whose actions are routinely self-destructive. In the Sunset chapter, negotiations between the United States and Japan break down, resulting in the doom of the latter country, not because of a nefarious plot, but because everyone involved gets angry and kills each other over a game of mahjong. This guy ends up killing himself in a game of Russian roulette, trying to trick the Smiths into killing the president just because he wants to be the president himself. It's all completely absurd and feels like a parody of the kind of political schemers you would find in a show like House of Cards. And then there's the feelings of political impotence and powerlessness that are pervasive throughout the game. Despite being caught up in the action constantly and being hyped up by the game itself to be almost godlike, the Smith Syndicate are largely powerless to really affect anything that's happening in the plot. Destroying the Angel and the Heaven Smile Nest in the first mission has no appreciable effect on their numbers for the rest of the game. Japan is threatened with annihilation at the start of the Sunset chapter, and at the end it happens, and you're not sure if you helped or hindered this event or whether you were even supposed to do either. And then the alter ego mission was just a video game? What? This undercurrent of political powerlessness becomes incarnate in the game's climax, where you learn that the entire voting system of the United States is an elaborate ruse, where votes don't matter, and the true leader of the United States is the Secretary of Education, a hanged fat man who swings from a rope and must be shot in his giant swollen red testicle, unifying both these themes of political powerlessness and the absurdity of these supposedly grand political figures. Even Harmon Smith and Kun Lan, who are presented to be divine through most of the game, are shown to be vulnerable and even mortal by the end. Even their power is ephemeral. The game's use of contradiction throughout the myriad layers of its narrative is not just to produce a confusing atmosphere that makes the game hard to understand. It exists to reflect the incomprehensibility of the political climate surrounding its creation. The deliberate contradictions throughout the game are there to highlight that the world in which this game takes place, and our own world, is one that ardently refuses to follow any apparent rules, no matter how much we try to force it to. It's a game utterly steeped in post-9/11 political angst. The feeling that, rather than the world being divided into clearly labelled factions and identities, the world was a far more complicated, far more chaotic, practically eldritch place. And our individual ability to affect this miasma that was the world's political stage was so small as to be effectively non-existent. Post-9/11, our world wasn't a Oliver Stone world or a Tom Clancy world, it was pure, unadulterated Lovecraft. Kun Lan's Heaven Smiles, that exist only to cause terror, and Harmon Smith's Killer7, who exist only to exterminate Heaven Smiles, at the pleasure of the US government. Their conflict is the war on terror, in microcosm, as it was for the average person. Omnipresent and terrifying, yet utterly inscrutable and ultimately invisible. In the end, the struggle between Kun Lan and Harmon Smith goes on, without any clear winner or loser, without any sense of what's been lost or gained, or why any of it even happened in the first place. Because how could we ever hope to comprehend something on that scale? Harmon is the West, Kun Lan is the East, and the political struggles between the two might as well be completely incomprehensible to us. So then, what can we, as normal people, do other than just look inward and try to solve our own little problems in our own little world?
What is United States? What is the purpose of the president?
I'm Japanese. How the hell should I know? Figure it out yourself. There are more important things. Shit. Like finding out who you are.
I think it's significant that after the boss battle with the giant swollen testicle, and the Killer7 suffer what can only be described as mass ego death, the game's political concerns completely fall away, to focus entirely on the personal concerns of one Garcian Smith. It's only after this happens, when Amir Park Reiner appears to have achieved self-actualization, where the player is presented with their first actual choice to determine how the story ends, only for it to end up feeling like an entirely arbitrary choice between two factions you don't really care about, and, in contravention of big video game choice moment cliche, the outcome of your choice isn't really obvious or apparent. You just have to choose. The way the choice is framed even makes it seem more like an obstacle for Amir to get past on the way to his true goal, rather than any kind of culmination of his journey so far. How many times have you felt deeply concerned about an upcoming election, or some other political issue, only for all those concerns to melt away when something more pressing comes up in your life? How many times have you swelled with political agency in the run up to an election, only to be faced by a bunch of choices that mean nothing to you when you're finally in the ballot booth? I know it's happened to me, and here, it's even happening to the so-called Bloody Heartland, a reincarnating serial killer with supernatural powers. The structure of the game's levels feeds into this idea as well. Each chapter of the game is episodic because although the greater concerns of America and Japan and the Heaven Smiles are still moving along in the background, they aren't the immediate concerns of our heroes. More pressing personal situations constantly crop up to distract them from arguably the more important things. A guy calls you out on national TV, a figure from your past resurfaces. You know you should really care about the large concerns, be it upcoming elections or the machinations of a sinister trickster god, but it can be hard to think about that stuff when you're being called out by a team of murderous Power Rangers or you have bills to pay. When it comes to engaging with politics myself, I've often struggled to do it as much as I really feel like I should. I mean, I have a politics degree, surely I should be thinking about politics and doing stuff related to politics all the time, and I just sort of don't. My own personal concerns take precedence, and I don't like that they do, but they do. Even though it's a far more serious situation, it's hard to get fired up about the famine in Yemen when you've gone into overdraft and you're not due to be paid for another week. And then there's just times where I just feel bleaked out by politics, when it all gets just too complicated and too depressing, and I just find myself wanting to shut it out of my life entirely. I had those kinds of feelings about politics, the world, and my place within it bubbling inside me for a while before I played Killer7, but this game was significant in bringing those questions to the surface and really hitting me with them for the first time. Just like the ego death the Killer7 suffer in Coburn Elementary School, my first year of university was significant for me in finding out who I really was. A lot of the illusions I had about myself and the world around me were stripped from me in that time, and by the end I realised just how absurd my belief was that I knew how the world worked. How could I know the world if I didn't even know myself? For the majority of the game, Garcian Smith doesn't know himself, and concordantly, he's not really able to make any impact on what's going on, until he accepts himself as Amir Park Reiner. Now, the world has changed. Amir can wipe out the Heaven Smiles effortlessly to the point where there's only one left. He can actually choose and engage with politics even if he doesn't understand or really even care about the outcome. He even manages to see one of the game's most recurring characters for who they really are. Maybe. Hyperbolic as it may sound, this is the reason that I truly believe Killer7 to be one of the defining political works of the 2000s. It beautifully captures not only the feelings of powerlessness and impotence I had about the political landscape, the contempt I felt for ridiculous, obviously incompetent men who nonetheless seem to hold immense power, the way in which I engage with it on laissez-faire, when it's convenient for me basis, but also how the way we see the world is shaped by our own understanding, or lack thereof, of who we really are. It is the politics of the 2000s in microcosm, peered through television sets that are as omnipresent in Killer7 as they were in the 2000s. Killer7's absurd alternate world is not the way the world works. Its labyrinthine, nonsensical plot is not the way the world works, but it's sure as hell how the world feels. And that right there, that feeling, that's the key to this.
Naturally, I found myself being led to this place.
Long journey, but it ends here, Garcian.
To say that the story of Killer7 is weird is obvious, yes, but it remains the understatement of the century. Every single aspect of its plot seems almost deliberately designed to not just defy understanding, but actively reject it, and even taunt those who seek it. and I can understand why someone would be frustrated about that. It's only natural to seek answers to questions a work offers, and equally natural to want to fully grasp something, to feel as if you understand it and therefore appreciate it. But honestly, I think the biggest mistake you can make when trying to engage with Killer7 is to try to find your understanding and your enjoyment of it in the plot details and story minutiae. You certainly can enjoy it that way, but I don't necessarily think you should go into this game with the mindset of a detective, scouring the game for all the clues to put together the bigger picture. I think this is the kind of experience where you just have to go in with as little baggage or expectations as possible, and just kind of let it take you on its journey. All too often, I think we succumb to the temptation of seeing a work only in the most literal of terms, seeing the plot, backstory and beats of said plot as the entirety of what a story is. YouTube is flooded with lore videos that explain away every single thing you might ever want explained about your favourite pop culture franchise. Every work of fiction imaginable has a devoted wiki that itemises every conceivable thing about the work in question. We even have entire works of fiction of their own that seemingly exist only to explain things in other works. But I think it's important to remember that that stuff isn't really what stories are. Knowing the lore behind Fallout New Vegas might be interesting and might deepen your appreciation of the game, but is that why you fell in love with it? Does anyone truly fall in love with a work of fiction by reading its Wikipedia page? Have you ever loved something because it doesn't have any plot holes? Or is it in the feeling of it, the listening of it, the playing of it? A story is in the experiencing of it, how it's told, why, what it says to you, and most importantly of all, how you feel about it. Media like Killer7 simply can't be appreciated solely through a lens of what happens in this plot. You can't appreciate the game just by watching someone explain away the entire story on a YouTube video. It's a story that is told as much as in its style, pacing, structure, music, and individual scenes as it is on the plot synopsis you can read in the wiki. I love this game dearly, yet precious little of that love is found solely in terms of the plot. It's about how the game makes me feel, in the playing of it, in the scenes that happen, in everything it says and does. The point of art is not to explain a plot. The point of a plot is merely to be one component out of many that work together to express what the art is trying to say. To use a non-game example, I think director David Lynch understands this better than a lot of storytellers today. Most of the things he's made have, to some degree or another, blurred the lines between the real world, the world of facts, and the world of the interior, the world of dreams, of our own fears, expectations and emotions, with the inner world bleeding over and infecting the real with those same emotions. Is Eraserhead literally just a story about a guy being literally murdered by his literal horrifying demon baby? Probably not. The plot, the literal reality of what is occurring in front of you, is a means rather than an end for Lynch. A means to tell the real story he's trying to tell. A story told through how the movie makes you feel. And Killer7 is exactly the same. You can love Killer7 because of its plot, to be sure, and many people do. But not being able to get into that plot doesn't mean you can't love the game, because Killer7 is not just a plot. It's not just a story. It's an experience, an idea, a mood, a feeling communicated through every aspect of its design. You don't have to understand Killer7 to love it. I don't think you love something just because it makes sense or because you understand it. And I don't think you automatically hate everything that doesn't make literal sense to you. I think you love something because it says something to you. Everything else is just about making sure those words reach you. What Killer7 says to me is big and complicated and personal, but that's not the important question right now. The important question is, what will Killer7 say to you? What will its music, its style, its gameplay communicate to you? Well, there's only one way to find out.
It's Friday night. Let's dance.